Presenter is the 13th Bishop of the Diocese of Rhode Island, Bishop Nicholas Knisely. Bishop Knisely began his academic formation in a very different field of study. He began in the area of theoretical physics and studied black holes in particular before turning to material physics and other sciences associated with that particular discipline, and then found himself called in a rather different direction and went on to pursue ordination, served as the Dean of the Cathedral in Phoenix, and other parish ministries prior to that?
There's 3 other parishes.
3 other parishes prior to that. And has been in Rhode Island now for how long?
4 years.
4 years, very good. So he's here tonight to talk about atonement in many worlds and its connection to the idea of Christian worldview. So please join me in welcoming Bishop Knisely.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, and to sort of understand what this is about, let me tell you how it got started. One of our churches in Rhode Island is St. Stephen's, and it's right smack on the campus of Brown. And as a way to try and invite the Brown undergraduates into the congregation, they try to have provocative talks during Lent or during the year. And last winter, I got a call from the rector of the parish, Father John Alexander, who I think some of you out here would know. He's been very active. Is he a trustee of Bishop House, or just an all-around good guy? Well, John called me up and said, "Bishop, would you be willing to talk about extraterrestrials and the church?" And I said, "But Father John, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we're having kind of a series on speculative theology at St. Stephen's, and again, we're trying to get the students in, and would you be willing to do something on that?" And I thought about it, and I said, well, I could probably put something together on that. I don't know it would be very good, but I'll give it a shot. And he said, well, it'd be great, thank you. The weekend of the talk, it turned out we had a surprise snowstorm. We had incredible snow last year in New England, and this was just one of those, and I think we ended up with 12 inches of snow that fell in about 6 hours. And it started right at the beginning of the talk, and by the time I got out of the talk, I learned how good my 4-wheel drive car was. I managed to get back, and I wondered to myself why I was doing this, and I think it was God's sense of humor, because Dean Peavy was there and heard the talk, and I only found out sort of at the last minute that I'd have a dean of a seminary listening to me rattle on, and I thought, well, I'd better do a better job than I intended. But he was not offended by the talk and asked me if I would come out and give a version of it here. So I've had about a year to think a little bit more about the topic. And it turns out to be even more interesting than I initially imagined. So let me say that for a number of years when I was the rector of Trinity Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, it was my second rectorate, my third congregation that I served as a priest, I had a dual appointment. I was rector of the parish, and the staff sort of ran everything for me. I had a great assistant priest and a full-time deacon, as well as lay leadership. But I also was teaching at Lehigh, and I was teaching at Lehigh in the physics and the astronomy department, and taught there for 8 years. And it sort of got a reputation. The deal was, when they asked me to teach there, was I was willing to do it as long as I could wear clericals in the classroom. And my excuse was I didn't want to have to run home and change clothes and then change, poof, I'm a physicist, poof, I'm a priest. But the real reason was, frankly, I figured there'd be something sort of evangelistic about a person in clericals standing in front of a large lecture hall just teaching physics. And the students would ask me on occasion, what kind of church I went to, and was I really ordained? I said, yes, I'm an Episcopalian. Oh, a Pope's-Epiplian. Yeah, I'm one of them too. Oh, well, yeah. You don't go to church much, do you? No. I will say it worked out pretty well. I ended up baptizing a few of my students, and a few of them did come to the church. And that was worth it. But also, I think a lot of them sort of had to struggle with the fact that you could have a scientific training and a scientific background and also believe in the gospel. You could believe in God. You could believe in Jesus. And that was a challenge for a number of them. And in some ways, it was like being a talking dog. You just sort of there, and it didn't really matter what you said. It just sort of sounded good enough, and they were really impressed by that. Subsequently, I sort of began doing some writing on the topic. After I left Bethlehem, I was elected the dean of the cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona. And when I was in Arizona, the church was growing very rapidly, and I didn't have time to do very much in adult ed, and I was feeling guilty about that. And they asked me if I would do an adult education series. I said, I don't have time to put anything together. And I joked, I said, I could teach a physics class. And they said, that would be great. So I said, if you're serious, I'll teach one. I had a class that I taught at Lehigh called Physics for Poets. And I thought that might be interesting. And they all agreed, and I had about 50 people take the class, and they went out and bought physics textbooks. And we sat there in the great hall at the cathedral. And what was interesting was, for years I'd been teaching physics as a priest, but I'd never really been able to talk theologically about what was going on scientifically on the blackboard. And this was the first time I'd had that opportunity, and I discovered that I had done a lot more integration internally between my theological worldview and my scientific worldview than I had anticipated. And that set of lectures led to a book, my first book, and it's called Entangled States. It's not very good, don't buy it. Really, some of my clergy disobeyed me and bought it and read it, and they didn't explode or anything. But they asked me, and I think it was a very astute question. They asked me, "Who did you write this for?" And I said, thank you. Someone asked me. I wrote it for an older priest that I knew, person I was having conversations with, who had lost his faith and believed that science had the answers, and had stopped believing in the religion that he had been raised in and the religion that he had once given his life to serve. And the book is as much a sort of teaching of how science works and where the edge of science is and where science begins to fail as anything else. But it's really written for clergy, and clergy of a certain age, because I find younger clergy don't really struggle with this question. It's clergy who were raised in the very sort of height of the scientific method in the 50s and 60s that struggle with that as much. I wrote a little book of Lenten reflections called Lent is Not Rocket Science. It's been sort of popular. I think we're up to 15,000 copies or something now. And every Lent I get lovely notes from around the church. I just got one from Frank Wade. If you've been involved in the national doings of the Episcopal Church, you know that Frank Wade's been very active, and he wrote a lovely note saying how much he enjoyed the meditations. They're just a short series of meditations that start with the cosmic realm and work themselves down to the quantum mechanical realm, and then a set of meditations in Holy Week. They're very short. I think we were selling it for $1 on Kindle. I get nothing from any of these books, so I'm happy to flog them for you all. But if you're interested in this talk, that one's not bad, and I'm not ashamed of that one. And then there was another book that I wrote, and that was actually for the diocese, and that's just boring. It's a series of meditations on Luke Acts, and just Luke Acts. It's just theological things. But all of this has raised kind of a question, and I'm putting this all in the context for this talk, because there is an ongoing question about how science and religion ought to talk to each other. How do they inform each other's conversations? And it's not at all clear right now how that conversation should happen. But I hope by the end of this talk to sort of point out to you that this is not a new state. And in fact, it goes back to the earliest ages of what we know of as historical Greek philosophy. These are fundamental and basic questions that we've been asking. And I think as you are doing this work on looking at Christian worldviews, I'd like you to sort of keep in mind, how do we understand the world in which we are placed? Do we understand it as having purpose, or do we understand it as being miraculous out of random chance? And that's really the core of what we're talking about. It's I don't want to give it away too much, but it's sort of Aristotle versus Democritus. And those of you can nod knowingly if you know what that means, and the rest of you can just wait and I'll get to it. So atonement in the many worlds. It's a wonderfully sort of ambiguous title, and I hear you've been trying to figure out what it might mean. What I mean by it is the question of, given the fact that most modern physics believes in multiple worlds, it's a way of dealing with some of the confusion that we have about the randomness that's inherent in quantum physics. The fact that we really don't know what it means. We know how the math works, we know how to get predictions out of the technology, but we don't actually understand what it means philosophically. We don't know how to connect what the math is saying with what's actually happening at the subatomic level. And one of the ways we have tried to avoid that problem as scientists is to say, well, there are multiple universes, lots and lots of universes. And whenever a decision or a choice is made or an observation occurs, a universe branches into a new universe. And so you have a cascade of universes constantly happening at each point in a universe. So if you have all these multiple universes cascading constantly down a decision tree, does Jesus have to appear in each of them? Does there have to be an atonement in each of them? And there's probably an even easier way to think about this. And if there are multiple universes, let's just start with the simplest example, and let's just think about our universe and wonder about the question of if there is life somewhere else than on the surface of the earth. How would they understand the Creator? The Creator that we know, the person of Jesus Christ, who taught what we truly understand about the Father. What would another world know about that? So the subtitle is, does E.T. need Jesus? Rational and sentient, and there is another created order of rational beings in the universe that the Bible testifies to and that human beings have interacted with over time. And they have a life separate from ours, and there's some interest in that. And there are demons. Someone gave me the text to preach on tomorrow on the demons encountering Jesus. I thought, well, that's interesting. Did you know I was going to talk about this? And you set me up that way. But we'll see if you're around here tomorrow and you're going to be in church, we'll see what I do with it. So the demons, we're told, have fallen. They're angels who, for whatever reason, and there are various strands of biblical witness and traditions about what happened. Sometimes it's that they would not serve humans. Sometimes they were just proud and they could not serve God. Sometimes they thought they should be gods. It's a form of idolatry. But they somehow were able to sin, and they have separated themselves from what God created them to be. So if there are other beings elsewhere in the universe, we might be able to think of the angels and the demonic as a way of thinking through what this might look like, at least theologically. Are there other sentient races? Well, that's what you mean by it depends what you mean by sentient, doesn't it? So, dolphins. Dolphins are actually aware of themselves. They seem to have language. They seem to be able to teach each other phrases. They can communicate danger in the community. They remember and have relationships. They're social. They have so they have language. I mean, they really seem to be sentient, aware of themselves. They're not sentient to the degree that we are, but they are sentient. Elephants. There's these amazing stories, seriously, of elephants grieving the death of other elephants. They will walk in single file. Even when a human who has befriended the elephants dies, there are accounts. I'm not a large mammal biologist, so I'm just going to take take them for what they say, but there are these accounts of elephants showing the same respect to a human friend that they would show to another elephant of the herd who has died. So there's an awareness of life and death. There is a language we've discovered. Elephants are talking to each other constantly. It's just at subsonic frequencies. So it's only when we tuned our microphones down to the very lowest frequencies we began to hear these calls that the elephants were having that were traveling for hundreds of miles. And it helped them coordinate their movements in the wilderness. Octopus? Why should the animals with backbones have all the fun? If you've ever worked, I'm from Rhode Island. We eat a lot of seafood. One kind of seafood, frankly, I won't eat is an octopus because octopus are apparently incredibly intelligent and are likely sentient. They like to play games. They like to trick the people who are keeping them. They hide, and they recognize and remember people who've abused them, and they will hide or try to squirt or do something to the people who have done that. What about dogs? Do dogs go to heaven? I mean, this is that question that every young priest is terrified of being asked. Well, let's sit down and let's talk about Francis for a while, but we also talk about Aquinas and Aristotle and what do we know about these sentient beings? They have a sentiency that is different than ours. They are part of creation. Did they fall because Adam fell? I think if you're going to be sort of strict about reading the biblical witness and taking it seriously, the answer is yes. That all of creation fell. That when Adam fell, whatever that means, and obviously it's mythic language, it's complicated language, but something happened and human beings departed from what they were created to be. And because of that, we were at enmity with one another and we were at enmity with God. And the way the biblical witness puts it, that affected the whole of the world, the whole of time and the whole of the world, and it required a Savior. But that Savior was human, though the salvific effect applies to all time and to all creation. So, okay, and that's actually a really interesting observation, that dolphins and elephants and octopuses and dogs participate in the fall in that they are part of the creation. They are designed to be living in harmony, and we no longer live in harmony, and there needs to be a repair that happens in the incarnation, that happens at the moment of atonement. We are made at one again with God by the efficacy of the cross. It changes our nature back to what we were, well, it modifies our nature. Maybe it doesn't put it back to what we were, but it gives us a new nature and a new way of being in the presence of God. And we bring the rest of creation with us. If you want to use the Genesis language, hey, we named them, we're bringing them with us. Right? We were given leadership and stewardship over all creation, and all of creation is changed by us. So, I'm in a seminary, right? We're all good. I've been doing a lot of reason here. We should probably check the Bible. What does the Bible say about all this? Not very much. There really isn't very much if you go through it. Now you can stretch and do some things. As far as the angels go, you can go to Hebrews 2:16. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. So let's go back to the angels. Angels fell. They fell not because of Adam. They fell for a different reason entirely. Jesus did not come to save the angels. Jesus came to save the descendants of Adam. So it appears that something important about humans is true, and that God has acted to save us, but has not acted to save the fallen angels. And just a reminder that Jesus, though, is Lord of all. Colossians 1, verse 16 and following is a whole long quote, but the essential point of the quote is, all things were created for him and through him. All things. Pantos. All things. And it doesn't seem to imply that all things here on the surface of the earth or all things in this region of the galaxy were created, but all things. And the Greek is clear. Even if they didn't understand what universe meant, even if they didn't understand the multiverse or the multiple universes, clearly that is what the Bible is anticipating, that all of creation is saved. So let's go to the patristic teaching, because we're good Anglicans, and we've used reason, and now we've saluted the Bible. What do the patristics say? Well, it's interesting. Actually, the patristic authors do talk about this. And there is a unanimity with one exception. Good old Origen. Yay, Origen. Origen actually postulates and presumes that there are other races of beings that need to encounter God. He's very careful about it. What he imagines in his writing, and if you want to ask me about it, I'll give you the specific chapters and various pieces of his writing. But he imagines that there are civilizations that arise in sequential order. This sort of expression of human arises and is saved, and then there is another type of life form that arises and is also saved, and another type of life form that arises and is also saved. And that idea that there were multiple types that arose and were saved was deemed rank heresy by everybody else. So it's Origen against everybody else. And unlike Athanasius, he did not win this argument. So everyone else is very clear. There is one incarnation. The incarnation is meant for humans, and human salvation saves everyone else. And they were at the point of... there's writings and questions of this period about, well, are there people who live on the bottom of the earth, the antipodes, who walk upside down and for whom it is daylight when it's night, when the sun is below? And they, first of all, said, well, you can't do that because you can't walk around upside down. But even if it did, even if there were other creatures that we could not see or encounter, God would have saved them too. But he saved them by Jesus and Jesus' action on the cross, the singular action on the cross. And that's the patristic witness uniformly. Chrysostom even writes it. Chrysostom, I think I heard you say it here. I say it the East Coast way. So one incarnation or many? That's the other question. When I was I think this question came to me when I was 6 or 7 in one of the first science fiction books I ever read. It was a series of short stories, Amazing Stories 6 or something like that. A babysitter had given to me. And in the story there were two guys in a rocket ship, and they had just landed on a new world, and they learned that someone exciting had been there. And the story was that Jesus had just been there and had been teaching them. And the one rocket guy was so excited that he left the other one behind because he was just going to go visit all the other planets. If Jesus was out there somewhere and he could meet him directly, he was going to do that. And I was so fascinated by that as a 6-year-old that I've sort of wondered about this for a long time. So, back to that sort of initial funny question, does E.T. need Jesus? If there are other races in the universe and they have fallen, is Jesus going to appear to them as their Savior as well? Can there be 2 or more incarnational forms? So is Jesus a human? So the Chalcedon formula for Jesus, right, is that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and that's a point of our faith. What would it mean to say Jesus is fully human and fully divine and fully Alpha Centaurian? And if you're going to do that, so he's of this race and of that race and of this extraterrestrial being and of that extraterrestrial being, now you've got an extreme slippery slope. Where do you stop? So it no longer becomes the unique expression of the Godhead in the human form of Jesus, but you end up with this sort of multifaceted expression. And now you've got a little bit of problem with the biblical witness. which says that the atonement, the cross is once and for all, not once and for some, and then maybe again for others. And of course, then you have to think about the question, if there are aliens, and by aliens I mean ETIs, extraterrestrial intelligent beings, not bacteria, have they fallen? But we know what fallenness looks to us. It's the state of sinfulness, and it's self-destructiveness. It's destruction. Luther talks about incarvatus se, that we try to go in a straight line, but because of our fallen nature, no matter how we try to get in a straight line to God, we always veer off. We always come back in on ourselves. We're selfish. We're covetous. We're idolatrous. We are not in the form that God created us to be. And we need surgery. Right? We know what a fallen state looks like to us. What would a fallen state look like to us in another race? Would it look the same way? Is that a universal? I don't know the answer to that. I think that's, if you're going to go down this route, that Jesus would appear in multiple forms to multiple extraterrestrial intelligences, he's going to have to take on different kind of struggles, and there's going to be likely different expressions of what fallenness would be. Because we fell, do they necessarily have to have as well? So again, now that's the Copernican principle again. If we're not special, and we were created and we fell, and if there were other extraterrestrial races, you would expect that they would fall too. Or else we're just really bad, and that makes us special, and that violates the Copernican principle. So hooray, we're not the only people who ever fell. Because the Copernican principle, as silly as it is an incredibly powerful tool in science, and it gets us all kinds of interesting things. So you don't ever give up the Copernican principle, the idea that we're not special, that we can take our experience and we can extrapolate. I mean, think about this. The Copernican principle says that if physics works on the surface of the Earth, it has to work on the surface of Mars. Everything we're doing, driving those little buggy cars around on the surface of Mars, depend on the Copernican principle. And the idea that we can say our star is like Alpha Centauri, is like Betelgeuse, is like Rigel, is like Bellatrix, is like Alnitab, Rassalasa Borealis, whatever star you want to choose, they all have the same mechanism, is all predicated on the fact that the physics and the science that works here on Earth works there as well. And if it doesn't, we have a huge problem. So if we fell, would they have fallen as well? The angels fell. We fell. The angels fell. So we've got a sample set of 2 and 100% fall rate. So the atonement in context. So, and again, this comes back to it. What does the atonement mean for humans? Well, the atonement is a way of, and choose your millennia, choose your answer. But if you want to walk away with nothing else other than I tell some jokes, remember this: there have been different understandings of what the atonement means. There are multiple understandings. There's a patristic understanding of the atonement. There are a couple of medieval understandings of the atonement. There is the Reformation understanding of the atonement, and we're probably seeing new understandings of the atonement develop. And they're all right, and they're all sort of not complete at once. And I think you could, if I was a historian of theology, I would be writing a paper on the fact that there are probably important intellectual shifts that happen, and the atonement model that seemed to make sense to people before no longer makes sense. Thomas Kuhn talks about the nature of scientific revolution as these paradigm shifts. I think you can talk about the shifts that Phyllis Tickle talks about, the 500-year or so shifts in Christian understanding as being related to the atonement no longer makes sense, and we have to come up with a new atonement. I don't know if there's a causal relationship, but in my mind there's clearly a correlation between the two. What does the atonement mean for us as humans? Well, the implications are, and the efficacy of the atonement is that we have a pathway open to us that we did not have open before, that allow us to realize something we were not originally created to be, and that is divine. Because Jesus is that hinge between God and humans, and because if you will pardon me my Platonic thinking here a second, Jesus changes the archetypal form of what human means, swaps out the broken axle that we had and puts in not just a new axle, but a radically improved axle, and gives us the ability now as humans to be taken into the presence of God and into the Godhead, changing our anthropology, our doctrine of what it is to be human forever as a result. The atonement is a big deal. What does it mean for an alien? And here, this is an interesting observation, and Jesus incarnated as a human, and the atonement is efficacious for human beings. You know, we don't say the atonement is efficacious for elephants. We don't say the atonement is efficacious in the same way. It's efficacious in that it changes the fallenness of creation, but it does not make elephants both creature and divine. It does that for humans. There's a specialness about humans, a chosenness about humans that isn't true for other things. And if you're going to think about the angels, which is our other sort of example of a rational set of things, the incarnation changes what it is to be human, does not change what it is to be angelic. Angels still keep the orders. They still are rational beings. They still have a purpose from God, and it's different than that of humans. But humans, which were made a little lower than the angels, are now seated at the right hand of God. So there's clearly something happening for part of creation and not for all. And again, we have a sample set of 2 here, but you can at least sort of begin to think about the implications of that. All right, so here are my, here's my sort of key slide. And this goes to this idea of Christian worldview. There was, at the very beginning of Greek philosophy, and I've been sort of dancing around the outside of this all through this talk, this question of a conflict between Aristotelian thought and the atomicists. Now, you know about Aristotle, right? You remember him. He, taught Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great went and did all kinds of silly stuff. And he was the student of Plato, who was the student of Socrates. And there's that wonderful Porch of Athens painting where you have Plato modeled on Leonardo da Vinci, and he's standing there. He's pointing up. Plato is the idealist. He's my hero. I love idealists. And Aristotle is standing there beside him with his hand out, said, no, what matters is what's real. Don't worry about the ideals. Focus on what's real and derive what you can from what's real. And in that conversation, Aristotle goes another step and says things have a purpose and they have an end. Things are created by design. A chair is a chair not because it somehow reflects the archetypal cosmic expression of chair, but because you can sit in it. Right? It's designed for a purpose. It has an end in its creation, as opposed to somehow being associated with a world of forms and ideas. Aristotle believed everything had a purpose, and the argument about there has to be an unmoved mover that obviously proves the existence of God makes sense to you if you're an Aristotelian, because there has to be a sort of arc, a teleological purpose to what creation was made. Contra Aristotle, and we don't learn much about them when our high school and college philosophy courses, but there is another group of people started really with Democritus. He's the same guy. Remember, I think I got this right, he used to fill his mouth with rocks and start talking and try and shout over the ocean so he could give incredibly powerful speeches. He had this idea that the universe was made up not of meaning, but of random bits of pieces that assembled and disassembled. And Lucretius and Epictetus and other followers in the atomicists believed this as well. This whole idea that the universe has no ultimate purpose, but is an assembly of interchangeable parts that randomly assemble and disassemble into these extraordinary forms, was highly offensive in the Middle Ages. And so we didn't talk about it. And it really is only in the late 19th century, as alchemy turns into chemistry, and we begin to realize, oh yeah, there are things like hydrogen atoms, and they're all kind of the same, and there are oxygen atoms. And, sure, there's some isotopes, and sure, there are some different configurations, but they're essentially the same. And protons, now we're starting to get interesting. Protons are all protons, and neutrons are all neutrons, and electrons are all electrons. And it's a huge question in science. How do electrons, how does that happen? But it happened. And so you have this sort of set of things that randomly move around. And at its core, there's this fundamental argument going on in the science and atheist, the scientific atheist debate with the religious worldview. Is there a teleology to creation? Is there a story being told that has a climactic moment? Or is this just random chance? Part of the reason, going back to the many worlds, that scientists have to come up with the many worlds model is because they're trying to avoid the anthropic argument. You ever heard the anthropic argument? Anthropic argument is, if you look at the universe as it is now, there are some extraordinary coincidences. The binding energy of quarks in a neutron is just exactly what it has to be to let you have matter that's more complicated than elementary particles. The binding energy of a neutron and a proton in a hydrogen isotope is exactly what it has to be, within a few percent, to allow you to get things like helium and lithium and carbon and iron and all the other things that are made in the cores of stars. And if you go through the sort of universe, you see again and again and again these kinds of extraordinary coincidences. To a person of faith, like, yeah, that's great. That's exactly what we would expect to happen in a universe that has a purpose and has a reason for existing. To a scientist that doesn't admit that and essentially is an atomicist who says, no, it's random, it's purposeless, and it's interesting, well, then there can't be. And so if you have these extraordinary coincidences, how do you explain them? Well, either there is some sort of design, or you have to say, no, there's lots of universes. And we just happen to be in a universe that has these particular parameters that allow life to exist. That's another motivating argument for the many worlds theory. And it is at its core a way of avoiding the design argument, the teleological argument. It's the Aristotelians versus the atomicists again. So an Aristotelian who would be very comfortable with the Christian worldview would say there is a purpose. And we learn the purpose. We have it revealed in the person of Jesus. We have it revealed in the stories of the chosen people of God. We have it revealed again and again in the mysteries and the sacraments of the church. An atomicist would say, no, just random. Now, I don't mean to just dismiss it, because the atomicist model is incredibly powerful. And all the cool stuff that I have, all my Apple wristwatches and my Kindles and my doodahs and gigas and things like that, and the airplane that brought me here, all those are based on that worldview. So it's a very powerful and very useful worldview. And you have to you pay your money and you take your choice. Is creation a random collection of interchangeable parts? Or how special are we? So, and I'll leave you with this. The fact that we are special, if we're in a teleological universe, and the universe was created for us. Actually, I've been reading through a book, and the author points out, in fact, you can do the calculation, the universe is incredibly big. But given how inefficient creation is, and the profligacy of nature, if you're going to have a race of human beings on an earth made up of the complicated material that we're made up with, you kind of have to have a universe just about the size of universe we have to make enough stars that kick off enough higher order elements, that kick off enough structure that give us what we are. So it's not that there's a big universe out there, it's got to be something else to it. there's a big universe out there so that we, the specialized part of it, could come into existence. How special are we? I think that's a really interesting sort of question that I play with a lot. Now, we're not special because of what we've done. We're special because God chose us, much like the children of Israel. They aren't special except that God chose them, and they are God's chosen people, and that makes them special. We are God's...
Transmitted that for 10,000
Right.
years, gone extinct. We might be at some point, and we just missed it.
Right. I mean, I think you could argue that if they are still there, so remember that term in the Great Equation that had the lifetime of the civilization. Let's assume it's not short and be optimistic and think it's long. That radio technology is a stepping stone to a deeper technology, and they only use radio technology for a few hundred years. Yeah. If you knew that there was a likelihood there'd be other civilizations out there, and you wanted them to know they were not alone, would you leave a lighthouse burning so they could know that? If you had the technology that you could do that at relatively low cost, would you just start broadcasting in radio? You know, we're here too. We're here too. Come see us. I would. And I think that's part of our human nature, that we would want to be found. We want to have a relationship. We want to talk. So I think that would be the counter argument to that. Well, it is, and that's the thing, that it presumes an awful lot, and I'm sad to say I'm slowly coming to the conclusion in my own sort of heart that we're it right now. That we don't have 250,000, we don't have the Galactic Council of Planets to go visit. That we're it. And I think that is a very important thing for us to realize. If we're the only sentient conscious life in the entire universe right now, we are more precious than we can even begin to imagine. And the fact that we are not treating other life that we encounter, which is in this incredible once-in-a-universe miracle, with the kind of respect that we ought to, is really an incredible sin that I don't think we've begun to plumb the depth of.
Another possibility is that some other civilizations have observed what we do with our technology and chose to be very quiet.
Right. Right. I mean, that's the sort of flip side of they're about to take us over and take us to Ice Planet 9 in chains. There were some nice seminarians in the back there, Dean. But yeah, they could have observed us and sort of decided that we are not worthy to join the Federation of Planets yet. No, and that's a completely realistic thing. They put us in quarantine until we grow out of this.
My question's about parallel worlds, and one of the ways I've heard a many universe theory explained is that whenever there's a decision to be made, if I choose to wave my hand at you, in another parallel universe, there's a version of me that did not wave my hand at you. So I guess if we accept that, is there a universe where Jesus declined to die on the cross, where Mary, unto me a child was born, will be born, no thank you? Is there a version of the universe in a parallel form where those didn't happen?
I have to admit that I have an allergic reaction to parallel to that. I mean, that's the sort of Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. That's a classic interpretation. The problem is that, like I said in the beginning, we know what the math does. We know how to make the math do really interesting things and give us transistors and semiconductors and all kinds of interesting things, but we don't know what it actually means because the math is saying ridiculous stuff to us. And if you're going to have a parallel universe in which Jesus chooses not to be incarnate, or Mary, declines God's invitation, to bear the Messiah. You've gone pretty far down the track of the atomists and left behind the Aristotelian. And I think it would be a pretty good argument from theology that the many worlds model isn't going to make sense. And I will say, and I've been fascinated by this, is a new bit of research. It has to do with the cosmological constant and dark matter and dark energy. But there's a revival of David Bain and de Broglie's understanding of quantum physics, which is a deterministic understanding of quantum physics. You lose local reality, but you gain determinism. And it's something that was played around with the 50s and 60s. And I'm being very technical, I apologize, but it doesn't violate Bell's hypothesis. It allows you basically to have quantum mechanics and have determinism still. So I just say that because I think there may be an escape hatch here where we can have sort of the complicated math that works really well, but there may be a different way to understand it than we have gone to yet that doesn't require us to sort of go into Never Never Land and come up with things. And I think the argument from theology, Bob Russell, who's the director of the Center for Natural Theology out in Berkeley, California, part of the GTU constellation of places, he's written a book, Time and Eternity, sort of riffing off Pannenberg's work. And in Time and Eternity, he wants to posit from first principles that a resurrection happened, a bodily resurrection happened. He's a physicist as well as a theologian, much smarter than I am. And he's actually worked out the math. So what does that do? And it turns out it takes you in a certain subclass of possible universes in cosmological thought that are called block universes. And it turns out that those are interesting in their own right. And I think, and I just one last thing, a dear friend of mine died 2 years ago in the Society of Ordained Scientists, the religious order of which I'm part. And he was a Jesuit. He was a professor of cosmology at the University of Arizona. And he was working on the pre-existence of universes using Aristotle's thought as it was sort of translated and understood by Aquinas. So there's this idea, and I think, I'm just going back to your question of, gee, we end up in these really sort of weird theological conundrums if we play with this too far. What do we do with that? I think theology has something to say to science. And it may be that the theology can say to science, this takes you into a silly place. And maybe you can just throw all that out because there are other ways to think about creation than simply mathematical and deterministic ways. And there is a contribution theology can make to the scientific endeavor. That's not a universally held view, but I'm beginning to think it more and more strongly as I sort of get deeper into the philosophy of physics. It's kind of a hobby of mine now. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry. Patristics is the study of the writings of the fathers of the church. So it's sort of the writings from about 100 AD through, depends how strongly you feel about the Reformation, to the medieval period. If you're a Protestant, you're going to include the Reformation in patristics. So when it would be Chrysostom and Augustine and Anselm and I apologize. I didn't realize we'd have a mixed crowd here. It's a technical term. So it's just patristics means it's in sort of classic Anglican understanding of how we answer questions. We have sort of three things we look at. We look at a biblical witness, so the Bible, Scripture. We look at tradition, which is usually patristic writing. What did the great sort of thinkers and doctors of the church have to say about a question? And then we use human reason. That's Hooker's three-stranded rope is the language I like for how we... so I was basically sort of, for the people here who teach, saluting that. I apologize.
I guess I'd like your comments in a general way about the supposed conflict between the scientific worldview, Christian worldview, and then, if you would, just explain why you find that older clergy have more problems with this than, say, the younger clergy.
So I think you could put the conflict right down between the atomists and the teleologists, that there is a purpose and a reason, a story that is being told in the experience of creation. And that is an act of faith. I think it's an experience that I've had. It resonates deeply within me. A scientist would say no, it has to be random, it has to be interchangeable, and it has to not depend on something outside, because by Occam's razor, the moment you start allowing for a divine creature and angels and all the other things that we can't test, you're outside the realm of science. Now, having said that, there are things that are true that are not scientifically measurable. Karl Popper, are you familiar with Popper's work on the philosophy of science? Popper says that things that are scientific are things which are falsifiable. So I have to be able to make a statement that I can prove is wrong, and then I'm talking about science, which is why, as much as I would like intelligent design, as we talk about it, to be scientific, I believe it as a philosophy, I believe it as an act of faith, but until I can figure out a way to do an experiment, I can't test it, so I can't claim it's scientific, at least in a Popperian sort of understanding. So I mean, you have that distinction, and you know, if you gave me a couple more days, I'd wander you through Gödel's theorem and the incompleteness of logic and all the other things. Why do I think so? If you grew up in an era of great progressive thought that believed that science was going to solve everything, and that was as much propaganda as it was true, but it was the sort of common belief that we would use our scientific skills in the West to solve all illness. We would figure out ways to feed people. We would figure out ways to make plenty of room. If we needed a new planet, we would construct one. And you know, I'm older than I look. And I remember, I'm 55, and I remember when I was 5 and 6 years old, and you watch the old science fiction stories, there was this idea that we were, I went to the atomic bowling lanes, for heaven's sakes. It was just this idea that things were going to get better, and science was going to do it, and religion was something that we were going to outgrow. And religion was something, and for a whole group of clergy that are in their 60s and 70s, for whom that was kind of the air they breathed and the water they swam in, it's been a struggle for them all along. I remember this dear friend of mine, he was stated clerk of a state presbytery, and he was retired, and when I was a seminarian, we were talking about faith, and he knew I'd been a scientist, and he turned to me, and absolutely seriously, he said, I really do think, because it would make sense finally, that Jesus was an alien from another race. And I looked at him, and well, that kind of blows the anthropology argument out, doesn't it? But that's where he was thinking about it. I find younger clergy don't worry about it so much because they're not modernists, they're postmodernists, and they are used to two things being true simultaneously. It's less of a scandal intellectually. A modernist is one thing is true and the other thing is false. And a postmodernist, or I'm actually, if you were to ask me specifically, I'm a post-positivist. Actually Pope Benedict, was clear he was a post-positivist as well. And I think there's a lot to that. There is a truth, there is an absolute truth, but we can only get arbitrarily close to it. We can never get all the way to it. So there's always going to be a sort of a contingency about everything we say as a result. And I think younger clergy who are younger people who are sort of, that's the air and the culture they're raised in, find this conflict less troubling. And in fact, I think they go at science in a different way. Go back to my first slide with E.T. You could argue that E.T. is kind of that seminal moment in Western culture where we start to look at science with deep, deep suspicion. Remember who the villains in the movie E.T. are, right? It's not the people who are going to save us finally. It's not, Johnny Quest and Dr. Quest and all that wonderful stuff. Now it's the scientists are going to destroy the alien with the deep emotional connection with the children. And that leads you to Blade Runner and Mad Max and a sort of whole sort of dystopian worldview. And I think the idea of science is being treated with distrust. And you certainly, scientists talk about this a lot and with a great deal of sadness because people don't automatically believe everything a scientist says anymore. Darn. So welcome to the clergy experience.
We have time perhaps for one more question.
In the way back.
I've probably watched just enough science fiction to be dangerous, so I don't know if this will make any sense. But I'm just wondering about. I'm really curious about the incarnation question, and is there any space-time continuum idea where maybe another universe is kind of on a different wave than us, and that an incarnation for another race would be contextualized, or something like Christ was contextualized for humanity.
Let me just point out postmodern.
Yep. No, I'm not professors. I'm not.
No. I'm hearing that postmodern worldview. Yes. So it goes back to the other question about many worlds, whether it's many worlds that are branching from each point, or if you're doing string theory. String theory sort of posits multiple dimensions higher than ours. So with the 4 dimensions we live in, and various versions of string theory go between 9 and 32 dimensions, and I think people mostly settled at 9. But when you do that, you end up with sort of sheets of universes on top of each other, and they call that the brain, because it's made up of layers of membranes. And you could argue that supernatural experiences are the way that people are being able to sort of tunnel between different sheets of membranes on the brain. And it's a really evocative and interesting way of thinking, and it might sort of lead you down that path of, could you have another expression of incarnation in a completely separate universe? But string theory doesn't seem to be able to make any predictions. And so people are starting to abandon it. Even Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory has abandoned string theory. And it's actually interesting, he's abandoning it for the same reason in the show that people are abandoning it in real life. It fails Popper's test. It can explain everything, it predicts nothing. And so people are starting to walk away from it. But if, tomorrow we wake up and some French research team has announced this great breakthrough in it, I think it goes back to in the multiverse. So you have a universe of universes, capital U and small u. When the Bible and the biblical witness talks about once and for all time, are they imagining this particular universe, this particular cosmos, or does all mean all in that, or does all mean in this particular instance? And I think that would be the question we'd have to answer. My sort of reading of what they were thinking, and they're writing, to my mind, out of a Platonic worldview, that they mean all, in the idealized sense, in the big capital universe. So I guess the answer is no.
And that is all we have time for. So please, yes. Thank you very much.